I tell you these things for what they are worth. They are true things. They happened. In Fat's opinion, his apartment had been saturated with high levels of radiation of some kind. In fact, he had seen it, blue light dancing like St. Elmo's fire. And, what was more, the aurora that sizzled around the apartment behaved as if it were sentient and alive. When it entered objects, it interfered with their causal processes, and when it reached Fat's head, it transferred not just information to him, which it did, but also a personality which wasn't Fat's, a person with different memories, customs, tastes, and habits. For the first and only time in his life, Fat stopped drinking wine and bought beer, foreign beer, and he called his dog he and his cat she, although he knew, or had previously known, that the dog was a she and the cat a he. This had annoyed Beth. Fat wore different clothes and carefully trimmed down his beard. When he looked in the bathroom mirror while trimming it, he saw an unfamiliar person, although it was his regular self, not changed. Also, the climate seemed wrong. The air was too dry and too hot, not the right altitude and not the right humidity. Fat had the subjective impression that a moment ago he'd been living in a high, cool, moist region of the world and not in Orange County, California. Plus the fact that this inner ratiocination took the form of Koine Greek, which he did not understand as a language, nor as a phenomenon going on in his head. And he had a lot of trouble driving his car. He couldn't figure out where the controls were. They all seemed to be in the wrong places. Perhaps most remarkable of all, Fat experienced a particularly vivid dream, if dream it was, about a Soviet woman who would be contacting him by mail. In the dream, he was shown a photograph of her. She had blonde hair, and he was told her name is Sadasa Olna. An urgent message fired into Fat's head that he must respond to her letter when it came. 2 days later, a registered airmail letter arrived from the Soviet Union, which shocked Fat into a state of terror. The letter had been sent by a man, who Fat had never heard of. Fat wasn't used to getting letters from the Soviet Union anyhow, who wanted 1, a photograph of Fat, 2, a specimen of Fat's handwriting, in particular his signature. To Beth, Fat said, "Today is Monday. On Wednesday another letter will come. This will be from the woman." On Wednesday, Fat received a plethora of letters, 7 in all. Without opening them, he fished among them and pointed out one which had no return name or address on it. "That's it," he said to Beth, who by now was also freaked. "Open it and look at it, but don't let me see her name and address or I'll answer it." Beth opened it. Instead of a letter per se, she found a Xerox sheet on which 2 book reviews from the left-wing New York newspaper The Daily World had just been juxtaposed. The reviewer described the author of the books as a Soviet national living in the United States. From the reviews, it was obvious that the author was a party member. "My God!" Beth, turning the Xerox sheet over. "The author's name and address is written on the back." "A woman?" Fat said. "Yes," Beth said. I never found out from Fat and Beth what they did with the 2 letters. From hints Fat dropped, I deduced that he finally answered the first one, having decided that it was innocent. But what he did with the Xerox one, which really wasn't a letter in the strict sense of the term, I do not to this day know, nor do I want to know. Maybe he burned it. Maybe he turned it over to the police or the FBI or the CIA. In any case, I doubt if he answered it. For one thing, he refused to look at the back of the Xerox sheet where the woman's name and address appeared. He had the conviction that if he saw this information, he would answer her whether he wanted to or not. Maybe so. Who can say? First, 8 hours of graphic information is fired at you from sources unknown, taking the form of lurid phosphine activity in 80 colors arranged like modern abstract paintings. Then you dream about 3-eyed people in glass bubbles and electronic gear. Then your apartment fills up with St. Elmo's fire, plasmatic energy, which appears to be alive and to think. Your animals die. You are overcome by a different personality who thinks in Greek. You dream about Russians. And finally, you get a couple of Soviet letters within a 3-day period, which you were told were coming. But the total impression isn't bad, because some of the information saves your son's life. Oh yes, one more thing. Fat found himself seeing ancient Rome superimposed over California 1974. Well, I'll say this. Fat's encounter may not have been with God, but it certainly was with something. No wonder Fat started scratching out page after page of his exegesis. I'd have done the same. He wasn't just theory-mongering for the sake of it. He was trying to figure out what the fuck had happened to him. If Fat had simply been crazy, he certainly found a unique form, an original way of doing it. Being in therapy at the time, Fat was always in therapy, he asked that a Rorschach test be given to him to determine if he had become a schizophrenic. The test, upon his taking it, showed only a mild neurosis. So much for that theory. All these events took place in March 1974. The month before that, Fat had an impacted wisdom tooth removed. For this, the oral surgeon administered a hit of 4-sodium pentothal. Later that afternoon, back at home and in great pain, Fat had gotten Beth to phone for some oral pain medication. Being as miserable as he was, Fat himself had answered the door when the pharmacy delivery person knocked. When he opened the door, he found himself facing a lovely, dark-haired young woman who held out a small white bag containing the Darvon N. But Fat, despite his enormous pain, cared nothing about the pills, because his attention had fastened on the gleaming gold necklace about the girl's neck. He couldn't take his eyes off it. Dazed from pain, and from the sodium pentothal, and exhausted by the ordeal he had gone through, he nonetheless managed to ask the girl what the symbol shaped in gold at the center of the necklace represented. It was a fish in profile. Touching the golden fish with one slender finger, the girl said, "This is a sign used by the early Christians." Instantly, Fat experienced a flashback. He remembered, just for a half-second, remembered ancient Rome and himself as an early Christian, the entire ancient world and his furtive, frightened life as a secret Christian hunted by the Roman authorities burst over his mind. And then he was back in California in 1974, accepting the little white bag of pain pills. A month later, as he lay in bed unable to sleep, in the semi-gloom, listening to the radio, he started to see floating colors. Then the radio shrilled hideous, ugly sentences at him, and after 2 days of this, the vague colors began to rush toward him as if he were himself moving forward, faster and faster. And, as I depicted in my novel, A Scanner Darkly, the vague colors abruptly froze into sharp focus in the form of modern abstract paintings, literally tens of millions of them in rapid succession. Metacircuits in Fat's brain had been disinhibited by the fish sign and the words spoken by the girl. It's as simple as that. A few days later, Fat woke up and saw ancient Rome superimposed on California 1974 and thought in Koine Greek, the lingua franca of the Near East part of the Roman world, which was the part he saw. He did not know that the Koine was their lingua franca. He supposed that Latin was. And in addition, as I've already told you, he did not recognize the language of his thoughts even as a language. Horselover Fat is living in 2 different times and 2 different places, i.e. in 2 space-time continua. That is what took place in March 1974 because of the ancient fish sign presented to him the month before. His 2 space-time continua ceased to be separate and merged, and his 2 identities, personalities, also merged. Later, he heard a voice think inside his head, "There's someone else living in me, and he's not in this century." The other personality had figured it out. The other personality was thinking, and Fat, especially just before he fell asleep at night, could pick up the thoughts of this other personality as recently as a month ago, which is to say 4.5 years after the compartmentalization of the 2 persons broke down. Fat himself expressed it very well to me in early 1975 when he first began to confide in me. He called the personality in him, living in another century and in another place, Thomas. Thomas, Fat told me, is smarter than I am, and he knows more than I do. Of the 2 of us, Thomas is the master personality. He considered that good. Woe unto someone who has an evil or stupid other personality in his head. I said, "You mean once you were Thomas. You're a reincarnation of him, and you remembered him, and his—" "No, he's living now, living in ancient Rome, now. And he is not me. Reincarnation has nothing to do with it." "But your body," I said. Fat stared at me, nodding. "Right. It means my body is either in 2 space-time continua simultaneously, or else my body is nowhere at all." Entry 14 from the tractate. "The universe is information, and we are stationary in it, not 3-dimensional and not in space or time. The information fed to us we hypostatize into the phenomenal world. Entry 30, which is a restatement for emphasis. The phenomenal world does not exist. It is a hypostasis of the information processed by the mind. Fat had scared the shit out of me. He had extrapolated entries 14 and 30 from his experience, inferred them from discovering that someone else existed in his head, and that someone else was living in a different place at a different time, 2,000 years ago and 8,000 miles away. We are not individuals. We are stations in a single mind. We are supposed to remain separate from one another at all times. However, Fat had received by accident a signal, the golden fish sign, intended for Thomas. It was Thomas who dealt in fish signs, not Fat. If the girl hadn't explained the meaning of the sign, the breakdown of compartmentalization would not have occurred. But she did, and it did. Space and time were revealed to Fat, and to Thomas, as mere mechanisms of separation. Fat found himself viewing a double exposure of two realities superimposed, and Thomas probably found himself doing the same. Thomas probably wondered what the hell foreign language was happening in his head. Then he realized it wasn't even his head. There's someone else living in me, and he's not in this century. That was Thomas thinking that, not Fat, but it applied to Fat equally. But Thomas had the edge over Fat, because, as Fat said, Thomas was smarter. He was the master personality. He took over Fat, switched him off wine and onto beer, trimmed his beard, had trouble with the car. But more important, Thomas remembered, if that is the word, other selves, one in Minoan Crete, which is from 3000 BCE to 1100 BCE, a long, long time ago. Thomas even remembered a self before that, one which had come to this planet from the stars. Thomas was the ultimate non-fool of post-Neolithic times. As an early Christian of the apostolic age, he had not seen Jesus, but he knew people who had. My God, I'm losing control here trying to write this down. Thomas had figured out how to reconstitute himself after his physical death. All the early Christians knew how. It worked through anamnesis, the loss of amnesia, which, well, the system was supposed to work this way. When Thomas found himself dying, he would engram himself on the Christian fish sign, eat some strange pink, the same pink color as in the light which Fat had seen, some strange pink food and drink from a sacred pitcher kept in a cool cupboard, and then die. And when he was reborn, he would grow up and be a later person, not himself, until he was shown the fish sign. He had anticipated this happening about 40 years after his death. Wrong. It took almost 2,000 years. In this way, through this mechanism, time was abolished. Or, put another way, the tyranny of death was abolished. The promise of eternal life, which Christ held out to his little flock, was no hoax. Christ had taught them how to do it. It had to do with the immortal plasmate which Fat talked about, the living information slumbering at Nag Hammadi century after century. The Romans had found and murdered all the homoplasmates. All the early Christians cross-bonded to the plasmate. They died. The plasmate escaped to Nag Hammadi and slumbered as information on the codices. Until in 1945, the library was discovered and dug up and read. So Thomas had to wait not 40 years, but 2,000, because the golden fish sign wasn't enough. Immortality, the abolition of time and space, comes only through the logos or plasmate. Only it is immortal. We are talking about Christ.